It is 6 o'clock, so we want to get rolling. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Once again, gracious Father, we thank you for bringing us together. We thank you for the opportunities that you've given us. I pray that your Spirit would minister to us and that you would be our teacher during these moments we gather together. Minister to whatever needs we bring together in the sanctuary. You know what they are, and minister to those needs, we ask. In the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, as you can see from the projection, today we want to talk about Israel, the Jebusites, and the Assyrians. Now, I suspect all of you know a little bit about Israel, but when it comes to the Jebusites, I suspect that you probably don't know much about the Jebusites. Maybe you've never even heard of the Jebusites. But then when it comes to the Assyrians, you've probably heard a little bit about the Assyrians. In fact, I've mentioned them previously. But we want to talk about Israel, the Jebusites, and the Assyrians today. Now, another question that we can address is, who owns Jerusalem? Okay? And that'll be connected with what we talk about during our hour together. So back to the Jebusites. We want to talk about the Jebusites first. The Jebusites are mentioned 35 times in the Old Testament. That's the third most of the Canaanite tribes or peoples. Canaanites were kind of an amorphous group of different people who came in and occupied the land of Canaan. We talked previously about the Hittites. They're mentioned the most. But really, the Hittites aren't really native Canaanites, right? Do you remember the Hittites came from what is today central Turkey, what is called Anatolia. But as their empire expanded and grew significantly, many of the Hittites came and settled into the land of Canaan. That's one of the reasons why the Hittites are mentioned more than any of the other dwellers, the peoples who are in Canaan. You're also probably, maybe some of you have heard of the Amorites. They're the people who are second most mentioned in terms of the tribes of the peoples who dwelt in Canaan. But then third, we have this group of people called the the Jebusites. Who are the Jebusites? Well, briefly, they are the earliest occupants of Jerusalem. So, we read about them actually back in Genesis. I'm not going to go through all the 35 places in the Old Testament where they are mentioned, but in Numbers chapter 13, we read that Amalek is living in the land of the Negev. The Negev is the desert region of what is today Israel. It's all the way to the south, okay? So the Amalekite people were dwelling in that region. Not much water there. Difficult to survive. That's a tough life in the Negev. And then it also continues on in Numbers chapter 13. The Hittites and the Jebusites and the Amorites were living in the hill country. The hill country is the central ridge. There's 3 geographic regions in Israel. We have the coastal plain that borders the Mediterranean, flat land. And then inland from that, we have rolling hills. Sometimes the ancients would call them mountains. I wouldn't call them mountains. It's not a mountainous region. You can say some large hills, but that's the western hill country. And then, of course, we have the Jordan Rift. And that is the area where the Jordan River, beginning up in the Sea of Galilee, actually it begins even further north, all the way up to Mount Hermon. In the waters of Mount Hermon feed down into the Sea of Galilee, which is 600 feet below sea level. Think about that, 600 feet below sea level. And then from the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River flows south. Gravity carries it down to the Dead Sea, which means the Dead Sea is even lower than the Sea of Galilee. The Dead Sea is 1,300 feet below sea level. So the shoreline of the Dead Sea is literally the lowest place on the face of the earth. So we have this rift, okay, that is the central part of what is today Israel. And so that's the three different areas, geographic regions of Israel. But the people who occupy the central hill country, okay, are the Jebusites, the Hittites, and the Amorites. Now, one of the reasons why they were living in that area, and it was difficult to uproot them from that area, is because, well, if you occupy the high ground, and if you have walled, fortified cities, it's not easy to sack and to uproot those people from well-positioned, fortified cities. Okay, so at any rate, Numbers tells us that this is the land. Remember, Numbers is also part of the Exodus. Last time we were together, we talked about the Exodus. God raised up and took Israel out of the land of Egypt. They spent time down at Mount Sinai in the Sinai desert. And then they began the 40 years of wilderness wanderings, moving north as God charged them to take the promised land. Okay? And so this passage in Numbers is describing the peoples who are dwelling in the promised land in Canaan. And then we have a passage with Joshua. Okay? The book of Joshua, many of you are probably familiar with the fact that Joshua tells us the story of the conquest. Okay? Joshua came with Israel, conquered the cities of Jericho. Remember the walls coming tumbling down? Ai, Makkedah, Libnah, Lachish, Eglon, Hebron, Debir, sacking all of these cities as God opened up the land to the Israelite people. But we have this interesting passage here in Joshua chapter 15, and this is after Israel had secured the land. Now, as for the Jebusites, that is the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the sons of Judah could not drive them out, so that the Jebusites live with the sons of Judah at Jerusalem until this day. Now, that doesn't mean today, naturally, but at the time when the book of Joshua was written, the Jebusites were still living among the Jewish people, the Israeli people, at the time when the book of Joshua was written. Now, the reason why I asked that question at the very beginning of our time together is that Yasser Arafat, how many of you know who Yasser Arafat is? He's now deceased. Yasser Arafat, of course, was the founder and the leader of the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Army, PLA. PLO is organization. Okay, and he claims that the Palestinian people are the descendants of the Jebusites. So he claims that the Palestinian people have a right to Jerusalem because they were the earliest occupants of the city of Jerusalem. So that's an issue that we are dealing with even today. Now, later on in time, Judges, by the time we get to the book of Judges, what we have is the settlement. Okay, the settlement. The land has already been conquered. All the major city-states have been destroyed. And now, the land is apportioned up among the 12 tribes. The area around Jerusalem was given over to the tribe of Benjamin. Okay? And the charge that was given by Joshua to each of the 12 tribes is to finish the job of the conquest. Okay? The Canaanites were supposed to be completely removed from the land. Okay? But we read in the first chapter of the Judges is that the 12 tribes never finished the job. Okay? And so we have this one passage in chapter 1, verse 21, where the sons of Benjamin did not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites have lived with the sons of Benjamin in Jerusalem to this day. Okay? And to this day, of course, means to the day at which, or the time when, the book of Judges was written. Now, I've frequently talked about a group of scholars, very intelligent people, archaeologists, who are called minimalists. You familiar with these? We talked about them previously. So Nels Peter Lemke makes this statement, okay? There is no evidence of Jebus. Jebus was, of course, supposed to be the founder of the Jebusite people. He was supposedly a descendant of Ham. Who's Ham? One of the sons of Noah. Okay, so that's kind of the ancestry here. And so what Lemke is saying is there's no evidence of Jebus and the Jebusites outside of the Old Testament. So what he's basically saying is that the Old Testament authors just made up this name. There is no such thing as Jebusite people. Well, there's 35 mentions of the Jebusites. And it's not just in the Pentateuch. It's elsewhere in the scriptures as well. Okay? We also, and this is not concrete evidence, understand, but in the year 2200 BC, approximately there, we have a Mesopotamian contract. It's a tablet in cuneiform that was issued to a person named Yabusu. And the Y is also given the J name, so Jebusu is how that could be pronounced. And some people think that that's actually a reference to the early Jebusite people. Again, that's not concrete evidence. Later in time, Philo, who's a Jewish philosopher who lived during the first century, he lived in Alexandria, Egypt. Incidentally, there was a very large Jewish community in Alexandria, Egypt during the first century. He and Josephus, we've mentioned Josephus before. Josephus, a Jewish historian who likewise lived during the first century. They make mention of the Jebusites. And so they don't believe that the Jebusites were just some name that was made up by some Old Testament scholar who wrote the Pentateuch. Okay? Again, that's not concrete evidence, but we've got to be frank with the evidence. There's not an abundance of evidence that points to the Jebusites. And that may be because the Jebusites didn't survive. Okay, and as a consequence, there's no evidence that has existed since then. This is a photograph that I've taken recently of Jerusalem. And this part of Jerusalem is called the City of David. Okay, and it contains a collection of ruins from different periods of time. In the process of archaeology, quite commonly what you have is not only ruins from one period of time, but you also have ruins from later on in time, as structures are damaged and rebuilt, and damaged and rebuilt again and again and again. What you have here is a collection of construction from a number of different periods. But if you look at the slanted wall up near the top of the picture there, that dates back to the period of the Jebusites. Okay, we're talking about as far back as 1300 BC in that neighborhood. You can notice the tower over onto the left-hand side, the upper left-hand side, nice squared tower. That dates to the Hellenistic period. That would be the intertestamental period before the New Testament. And then you also have ruins from the time of King David, the monarchy. And those are some of the ruins that you see in the foreground down below the wall. Let me just show you a drawing which will help to give you an idea. So you can see help me with the colors here. Is that orange? Okay, that orange section represents ruins and remains from the Jebusite period. And then down below that, it looks like blue to me. Okay, that would be from the period of time of the kings, David, and the period following after David. And then I can see, to me, blue and purple looks the same. And so I'm assuming that the upper part with the squared tower, is that purple? Okay, that's a strategic guess. Okay, at any rate, just to show you, that's the photo, and that's where you can see different periods of construction over time. Now, what I want to mention is water. People need water to survive, right? I shared with you before that the land of Palestine is a semi-arid land. The further south you get, the drier it is. If you get up into Galilee, much more water up there, okay? And Jerusalem, it does not have a lot of water. It's certainly better than the Negev, further to the south. But there's only one water source around Jerusalem, and that is called the Gihon Spring, okay? And the Gihon Spring is at the foot of Mount Zion. It is outside of the city walls, okay? Which means if you want to draw water for drinking purposes, cleaning, anything of that sort, you've got to go outside of the city to draw water and bring it in, okay? And that's important for what we're going to be talking about in the moments to come. Okay, we read about the Jebusites a little bit later during the time of King David, okay? And this is where David was successful in wresting the city of the Jebusites away from the Jebusites, and of course became the capital city of the Jewish people. And this is a passage from 2 Samuel chapter 5. The king, that is David, and his men went to Jerusalem against the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, who said to David, "You will not come in here. The blind and the lame will ward you off," thinking David cannot come in. They believed that their city was so well fortified that there's no way that David and his troops will be able to sack them. So they make this comment: the blind and the lame are able to defend this city. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And David said on that day, "Whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind." So he's kind of throwing this back into their face. Okay? We sacked the city of the lame and the blind. So once again, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore it is said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. Now that's a puzzling passage, isn't it? Scratch your head wondering, what does that mean? Well, David knew, of course, that there's only one water source, and that's outside of the city walls, the Jebusite city walls, and that many times for ancient cities that are well fortified, you surround them and you starve them out, you wait them out, and besiege the city. But yet, the Jebusites were confident that the city couldn't be sacked. Somehow, they must have access to that water. How do they have access to that water? Well, in 1867, a British explorer by the name of Charles Warren discovered a tunnel and a water shaft that dipped down into a water basin. You can see the drawing. This is not my drawing, but you can see a tunnel that leads down beyond the city walls of the Jebusite city wall, and then it leads to a shaft that goes directly down. And of course, what the Jebusite people could do is they would go down that tunnel underground. This is an underground tunnel, okay? They would drop their baskets, their buckets down into this pool of water, pull the water up, and that was their water supply. Wow. So what had happened, okay, is the Jebusites realized that their city was vulnerable because they didn't have access to water. So what had they done? They had cut a water channel you can see over onto the lower right-hand corner. That's the Gihon Spring. That's where the water sprouts out. There's a lot of water. As a matter of fact, I've been in that Gihon Spring many times, okay? Water today, lots of water, okay? What they had done is they cut a horizontal shaft to bring that water underground inside of the city walls, okay? They also cut a channel vertically, and that would lead to the tunnel which they had cut, enabling them to go down that tunnel secretly so nobody can see them, drop their buckets down into it, and draw water from the Gihon Spring. They had all the water they wanted. Fascinating. Fascinating. Today you can walk down that tunnel. The Israelis have constructed a nice staircase. Okay, so it's easy. And then you can come to the shaft. Now there's a wall out and around the shaft, actually, kind of a guardrail out and around the shaft. And so I'm leaning way over to take this picture. And so you can see all the way down to the bottom of the water shaft. And this is where the Jebusite people would drop their water buckets. Okay. Now we have another passage. This comes from 1 Chronicles in chapter 11, which gives a little more detail as to what was happening at the time when the Jebusite city was sacked. 1 Chronicles chapter 11, David and all of Israel went to Jerusalem, that is to Jebus, where the Jebusites were, the inhabitants of the land. The inhabitants of Jebus said to David, "You will not come in here." Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, that is the city of David. And David said, "Whoever strikes the Jebusites first shall be chief and commander." So Joab, the son of Zeruiah, went up first, and he became chief. What does that mean? Again, this is kind of a puzzling statement until Warren shaft and tunnel were discovered. We know that Joab became the commander-in-chief of David's armies. We read about that later on, okay, in the scriptures. And what had happened is Joab probably held his breath, figuring that there has to be some way that the Jebusites are accessing this water. So I would guess that he held his breath, probably climbed through, somehow made his way over to the vertical shaft, where he could then see, oh, this is it. And so he probably returned, told the Israeli troops what he had discovered, and probably, I guess, probably at night, when most of the Jebusites would probably be sleeping, he probably led troops up that water shaft, out the tunnel, into the city, opening the city gates, and of course, the Jebusite city was sacked and taken. Amazing. So here we have archaeology that's illuminating the scriptures, helping us to understand more of what was happening when we read through this account of David and the Jebusites. Now, we're not finished, okay? We're not finished with Jerusalem. We're not finished with the water shaft, okay? About 200 years later, okay, during this period of time, Israel has split into two separate nations, okay, following after Solomon. Okay, Solomon, as wise as he wasn't very strategic, okay? He made some decisions that really aggravated many of the 12 tribes. So as a consequence, once Solomon had died, okay, we have his son Rehoboam. He became king. Rehoboam was even stupider, okay? The people came to Solomon, actually they came to Rehoboam and said, "Your father has taxed us heavily, As a matter of fact, a lot of that taxation resulted in the beautiful temple, okay, of Solomon, and also exacted a lot of labor, okay? And they asked Rehoboam to unburden them of the taxation and the labor. And Rehoboam said, we're just beginning. I'm not going to lighten the load. And that angered especially the northern tribes, okay? So they were led by Jeroboam, who's not related to David, incidentally, okay? Jeroboam took the 10 tribes, moved to the north, set up alternate worship sites at Bethel and Dan, 2 worship sites, pagan worship sites, okay? And the nation split into 2. So the northern 10 tribes from this point forward are known as Israel. So at this point, when you read in the Old Testament about Israel, we're not talking about the whole nation of Israel. It's the 10 northern tribes. And the 2 southern tribes are called Judah, and they have separate kings. Okay? So, we have the Assyrian Empire that expands. And here's a map of the Assyrian Empire. You can see the shading. Is this brown? Green. And then a lighter green. And then the lightest green. So you can see over the years, from the 9th to the 7th century, the expansion of the Assyrian Empire. Now, why did it take so long for the Assyrian Empire to expand? The Assyrians had already conquered Mesopotamia, but some of you who are listening in the past weeks are probably aware of why is it that they weren't able to expand further to the northwest and eventually into Palestine. And the answer is because the Hittites were there. Okay, the Hittites and the Neo-Hittite Empire, of course, occupied about 1,000 years. And of course, the Hittites were very strong at that period of time. And once the Hittite Empire had collapsed, then of course that opened the door for the Assyrians. So the Assyrians then slowly expanded their kingdom, their empire. And you'll notice with the lighter shaded region, and this is by the time we get into the 8th and into the 7th century BC, we see them intruding into the land that was occupied by Israel and Judah. We have many ruins from the Assyrians. These are ruins, of course, that have been extracted from what is today Iraq. So if you go to the British Museum, you can see the gate for Ashur-nasir-pal II. This is during the 9th century. This is the palace at Nimrud. If you've had an opportunity to go to New York, the best museum in the United States is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and they have a terrific collection of artifacts, including many biblical artifacts that are significant for the study of the Scriptures. And they have a room, of course, with many of the ruins of the Assyrians. So beautiful. Another shot, some of the palace, not only the gate entering into the palace, but also some of the walls, some of what are called the genies, these winged creatures that have the face, the head of a hawk. Zero in on that a little bit. And of course, we also have all along the walls in cuneiform script, where the kings are boasting of their achievements. But you don't have to go to New York. Yeah, you don't have to go to these far-off regions, to Paris, to London, to New York. You can go just a few miles up the road to the Oriental Institute Museum at the University of Chicago, okay? And you can see this. This is a relief from the Gate of Sargon II. And this is near at the time when the Assyrian Empire had expanded into Palestine. Among the many artifacts that have been discovered is this obelisk. This is an Assyrian obelisk from Shalmaneser III. This is dated to the middle of the 9th century. And on this obelisk, you can see many of the conquered people. depicted on the panels. This is on all four sides, okay? And these are the surrounding territories, some of which had not yet been conquered, but had been subjugated. And as subjugated lands, they became vassals. And of course, the Assyrians demanded tribute, that is heavy taxation. Sometimes taxation would be goods and commodities, perhaps food products, perhaps lumber, perhaps whatever it is that's valuable. And one of the panels is this panel, okay? And this is a depiction of Jehu. Jehu was one of the kings in the northern kingdom of Israel. You see him bowing down to Shalmaneser III, and he's bringing gifts, tribute. You can see the cuneiform script up above that's describing what's actually happening. Translated, this is Shalmaneser speaking. I received the tribute of Jehu, son of Omri, silver, gold, a golden bowl, a golden vase with pointed bottom, golden tumblers, golden buckets, tin, a staff for a king, and spears. This is an important piece of history because this is where the Assyrians were intruding into. They had not yet conquered the northern kingdom, but they were intruding into this area, enforcing Jehu to offer tribute. Now, incidentally, this panel is also important because it's the only picture from that period of time of any Israel or king in Judah. Okay? So it's pretty cool. You see him bowing down before Shalmaneser, and you see behind him the tribute that is being brought. Now, 2 Kings tells us a little bit about this period of time. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hoshea. Hoshea is later on in time from Jehu. Hoshea, in fact, was the last king of the northern kingdom of Israel, the last king. So Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hoshea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and had paid him tribute. The king of Assyria discovered that Hoshea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to the king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria. Well, there comes a point where poor people, and of course nobody has a great deal of wealth back in those days, but Israel was no longer able to come up with the tribute that was demanded by the Assyrians. And so what had happened is Hoshea turned further to the south to the Egyptians, and he basically pled for support from the Egyptians. If Israel falls, if Judah falls, you know who's next? He's going down into Egypt. And in fact, he did. Okay? So he's basically saying it would behoove you and me, all of us, to collaborate together and to ward off and to fight against the Assyrians. Well, didn't work. So we continue. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria. Samaria is another term that was used for the northern kingdom. This is the land that eventually became Samaria, that you read about in the New Testament, okay? The land to the north of Judah. So in the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. This is the year 722 BC, and I tell my students I don't tell you to memorize a lot of dates, but that's an important date. It's an anchor that helps us to understand the time flow of some of these dynamics. 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel falls to the Assyrians, and it becomes no more. Now, one of the things that the Assyrians did is they mixed the peoples. Okay, from the other conquered territories, they would import many of them into the land of Israel, and then they would deport many of the Israelis and relocate them to some of their other conquered territories. Okay, and there's strategy in that, because if you don't speak the same language as your neighbor, you're much less likely to rise up and rebel. As a consequence, the people in the northern area, Israel, began to intermarry with people who are not of the same DNA as Abraham's children, okay? So these were mixed blood Jews who proliferated in the land to the north. They came to be known as the Samaritans, okay? And the Jewish people in the south, in Judah, never embraced them as full-blooded Jews. They began to worship at a city called Samaria. It's a location of Mount Gerizim. And they set up a worship site there. They studied the Jewish scripture and they practiced their own form of Judaism, even though they were excluded. And during the intertestamental period, that is the Hellenistic period, the Jews from the south attacked and destroyed the temple at Mount Gerizim. And as a consequence, that's caused a lot of hatred and distrust between the Jewish people and the Samaritan people, which we read about in the New Testament. Okay? We have several instances where Jesus, for instance, goes to the well in Samaria. Most Jews would not even set foot in Samaria because of the hostilities. But Jesus traveled through Samaria, came to the well, okay, at Sychar, met with this Samaritan woman, and she said, "What on earth are you doing here?" And, again, according to custom back in those days, men didn't talk to women. And why are you talking to me? And, of course, you know the story. Read about it in John chapter 4, okay? At any rate, I'm getting off track a little bit. This is what happened way back in 722 BC and the years following after 722 BC, after the Assyrians came in, sacked Israel, the northern kingdom, and took over. Now again, we go back to our map. You can see the full extent of the Assyrians. We have looks darker to me. Golly, I don't even know what the color of that is. The earliest capital is in the middle of the screen there, called Ashur. Do you see that? Do I need to zoom in a little more? And then later on, during the time of the conquest of the northern kingdom, the capital was Nineveh. Most of you are probably familiar with Nineveh because it plays into another piece of scripture, and that is what? Jonah. You know, Jonah. He's got a whale of a story to tell. Okay? So, that shows you how the Assyrian kingdom expanded eventually over the years until finally it was overtaken by the Babylonians. And that's another period of time. We don't have time to get into that and talk about it. What are some of the remains that we have from this period of time? This is a fabulous panel from Sargon II's palace, okay? And you can see that Sargon's son is Sennacherib. He's the individual leading these persons. These persons, of course, have their swords with them, and they are following after their leader, Sennacherib. Sennacherib, of course, was one of those persons that was instrumental in conquering not only Israel, but the southern kingdom of Judah as well. Now, other items that have been discovered, these are called bulla. Bulla. These are clay pieces about this big around, not very big at all. And they are imprinted with the signet ring of the king. Okay? Several of these have been found, many of them actually in the city of David. And the two that you see represented here are, you can see the drawings down below. These are bullae from King Hezekiah. So official decrees, communications, if he wants to communicate with people in some of the surrounding cities and towns. Of course, he would send out a letter. He wants to make sure that the letter's not been tampered with, so he'll roll it up, put a band out and around it, and then he will impress onto this piece of clay with his signet ring to let people know that it's official. Okay. What I also want to point out is that you'll notice that there is not only, this is Paleo-Hebrew writing, is not what Hebrew looks like today. Many of you probably would recognize Hebrew script, but this is Paleo-Hebrew script, much earlier. But also you'll notice that centrally located here we have the scarab. Where does the scarab come from? Egypt, okay? Egypt. So this just goes to show how much influence Egypt had. All of us, even today as Christians, we don't realize how much we are influenced by the culture that surrounds us, even secular culture. Lots of times we want to push it away, but there's aspects of secular culture that are really attractive, right? And so we co-opt it and we Christianize it. And this is what's happening in ancient Judaism as well. They are co-opting some of, well, Egyptian culture, even during the time of Hezekiah. Now, many of you will recognize that the scriptures describe Hezekiah as being very devout. Okay, of all the kings that preceded him, he is described as being the most devout king of all the kings of the south. Now, he's a king of the south, not a king of the north. The north has already been wiped out, okay? But the Assyrians didn't stop at wiping out Israel. They continued to move further south, and they attacked Judah, and were very successful in attacking Judah. Here's another scarab. And then what do you see to the left of, I should say, another bulla with a scarab, okay? And what do you see to the left of that? It's an Egyptian ankh, okay? Just again to show you some of the Egyptian influence that had been a part of Israel during this period of time. Now, as the Assyrians attacked the south, that is Judah, they attacked this city. This is a drawing of the city of Lachish, okay, in what artists and archaeologists believe that the city of Lachish looked like back during this period of time, around the late 8th century, the beginning of the 7th century BC. You can see an administrative building in the beginning, and then many dwellings, and then you see a very strong fortified wall out and around the perimeter, and then the main entrance gate with the ramp leading up into the city. Okay? Well, the Assyrians attacked Lachish, and after a pitched battle, eventually conquered Lachish. If you go to Lachish today, you can tour the site, you can see remains of the city wall and the interior of the city as well. But maybe the best way to understand what happened is to go to London to the British Museum, because in the British Museum they have the, again, palace reliefs of King Sennacherib. And this depicts the Battle of Lachish. Let me zero in on some of these features here. You see here a tower of Lachish and the Jews that are defending themselves against those who are attacking. Down below, you'll see archers. And you also see a siege engine. You notice it has wheels on it. Can you see the wheels? They would wheel this up the hill, hide behind it, because of course you know that the Jewish people who are defending their town are throwing rocks, spears, shooting arrows, trying to dissuade these people from sacking the city. And so this is the attack on Lachish. You'll also notice that as we move further to the right on the panel, it's kind of like a comic book. Okay, it's not comic though, it's really describing what actually happened. You can see the people who have been sacked, who are retreating then from the city. And then down at the bottom here, you see many of the Jews impaled on stakes. Do you see that? Do I need to zoom in anymore? This is the earliest form of crucifixion. Of course, crucifixion was changed, of course, by the Romans as well. But this is some of what was happening as the Assyrians were attacking Lachish and the other cities. Okay, once again, as we move further to the right, we can see more archers attacking Again, you can't see the tower. That piece of the mosaic, that piece of the palace relief is missing. But you can see, again, siege engines over here on the left-hand side moving up towards to attack the city. This is an interesting siege engine because one of the things that the Jewish people were doing is they were trying to burn the siege engines, okay? And so do you see here, here is one of the Assyrians. He's flipping over his back with a big shovel or basin, water. Do you see the water spilling out there? I don't see anybody nodding their heads. It's right in the center here. It looks like a bunch of lines. Unfortunately, my laptop won't point it out to you. He's on the siege engine. You see the wheels behind it. You see the weapon, and then he's got here. That's all the further mine is going to zoom in. Right in the center of the picture, you can see a guy. Okay, and he's got this looks like a spoon. Okay, and then flowing out of the spoon, if you want to call it that, is these lines. That's supposed to be water that he's dousing the siege engine so that it does not catch fire. And you can see in the siege engine, you see an archer there, and behind him many more archers as they attack the city. And then another tower of Lachish. As we continue to move further to the right, this represents after the city had been seized, had been sacked. The slaves, these are Jewish slaves that are being taken back to Assyria. This is an interesting panel. You'll notice that the Assyrians are, especially the troops, are easily recognized because they have these conical hats, okay? So it's easy to determine who they are. And you'll see the two people who look like they're diving. Actually, they are being flayed alive. That is, they're having their skin torn off them. Again, the Assyrians were brutal in attacking people, mistreating people. This is supposed to be a deterrent to other cities resisting the Assyrians. And then, of course, if you go further to the right of the panel, you see two Jews being led by an Assyrian soldier. They have their hands lifted up, asking, begging for mercy. Another panel, again, we're moving further. Actually, we've turned the corner in the museum, the British Museum, but we see more of the Jews who are being taken back to Nineveh. Down at the bottom, you can see one of the Jews is being executed. You see a knife being stuck into his back. Up on the second section, the higher section, you see more Assyrian troops leading Jews who again are in position here begging for mercy. Some of them are on knees. Others are lying prostrate on the floor. And then finally we come to the throne, and this is where the Jewish slaves and prisoners are being presented to Sennacherib. Again, just the story. And these are kings, of course, they're boasting of their achievements. And of course, the sack of Lachish was significant. And that's one of the reasons why Sennacherib has this portrayed on his walls. Another piece, I don't want to bore you with all of these, but here, once again, you see on the left-hand side, you see an Assyrian soldier with a conical hat. And then these are Jews who are carrying lyres. Lyres are musical instruments. Now, what's this significant for? Because we have a psalm. Some of the psalms that we have in scriptures, this is Psalm 137, okay, is a psalm that was written during the exilic period, actually prior to the exilic period, during the period of time when many of these people were sacked and brought back to Assyria, and they're playing the lyre, musical instruments. I want to read for you a portion of Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. Upon the willows, in the midst of it, we hung our harps. For there our captors demanded of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." Upon the willows, there are the willows, we hung our harps. So it's just interesting that we've got a panel here that really illustrates one of the Psalms. This is a very bleak and distressing period in Israelite history. Okay? These are people who God had rescued from slavery in Egypt. And now, due to their lack of faith and disbelief, they find themselves captives once again and slaves once again. Well, let's continue with this story. It doesn't end with Lachish and what happened at Lachish, because all of Judea was sacked except one city, okay? And that city was Jerusalem. And of course, in Jerusalem was King Hezekiah, okay? And King Hezekiah had a prophet as a court advisor. This is called a court prophet. Okay, we have different kinds of prophets who function in different capacities in the nation of Israel. A court prophet is a prophet that's a trusted advisor to the king. And it just so happens that Isaiah, this is the guy that you know from Scripture, Ike, the prophet, Isaiah. He was the court advisor to Hezekiah during this period of time. And so this is what we read in Isaiah chapter 22. He's talking about Hezekiah, and he says, "You saw the breaches of the wall of the city of David, that they were many. And you collected the water of the lower pool. Then you counted the houses of Jerusalem. You tore down houses to fortify the wall. And you made a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool. But you did not depend upon him who made it." Isaiah is telling Hezekiah, the only way that this city is going to survive is if you trust in God. You notice I highlighted here, you saw that the breaches in the wall of the city of David were many. You tore down houses to fortify the wall. What's all that about? Well, between the time of King David and 200 years later, King Hezekiah, the city of Jerusalem had grown significantly, right? So not all of the population could fit inside of the old city walls. So when the Assyrians, of course, attack the northern kingdom of Israel, refugees come down to the south. They say, "Hey, the Assyrians are coming. Can't do anything about it." Of course, as they are attacking all the other cities in Judah, refugees come. And Hezekiah knew full well what he was up against. And of course, now the people from the countryside all flood into Jerusalem. There's not enough room. So what does he do? He enlarges the city walls. This was discovered some time ago. It's not a recent discovery, and this is not my picture either, but you can see an individual standing upon what is called the broad wall. This is the wall that was constructed by Hezekiah at this period of time to enlarge the city, to encompass many of the refugees, the people who had fled to the city. Today, that broad wall, you can see it in Jerusalem. This is a shot that I had taken several years ago. But this is a slice of history, an archaeological piece. Oh, Isaiah had more to say, okay? He says, he's talking about God, will bring down, or he could be talking about Sennacherib, he will bring down your high fortified walls and lay them low. He will bring them down to the ground, to the very dust. We have a strong city. He sets up walls and ramparts for security. He continues, those walls aren't going to protect you. Trust in the Lord forever, For in God the Lord we have an everlasting rock. He has brought low those who dwell on high, the unassailable city. Hezekiah thinks it's unassailable. Well, so did the Jebusites. He lays it low and casts it to the ground. Returning to that passage in Isaiah chapter 22, I highlighted the breaches and the wall, but he also says something else. He says, you collected the water of the lower pool, and you made a reservoir between the two walls for the water of the old pool. What's that all about? Well, they've discovered what is called Hezekiah's tunnel. And one of the things that Hezekiah did at the time when he learned that the Assyrians were coming, he had his engineers come and cut a water channel for about a third of a mile as it snakes through the rock. You can see here, this is a cutaway. If you look at the drawing here, up at the very upper right-hand corner, that's the temple. Okay, that's Solomon's temple. Then a little bit lower, you can see the palace complex. Then you can see Warren Shaft, the tunnel and shaft. Isn't that yellow? Okay. And then down below that, you can see where Hezekiah had his people cut this shaft, okay, this tunnel, all the way down to the lower pool. Of course, you can't make water climb, right? So it's got to follow the gravity. And what had happened is, as the city was enlarged, they enlarged it to encompass that lower part of the city, which includes a pool where much more water would go into the city, where the people could draw from the water, okay? In the New Testament period, that was called the Pool of Siloam. It's not the Pool of Siloam back then. It's simply the pool for survival. But that tunnel, you can walk today. I've walked it on numerous occasions with student groups, and just more recently with members of your church. These are two of my daughters, Ania in the foreground, Malene in the background. You can see how narrow it is. There's no lighting down there, so you have to bring your own lights. Many people bring flashlights or things you attach to your head. And it's really dark, and you get wet, okay? At times, the water will come up to your waist. Fortunately, you don't have to bring your scuba gear. It doesn't get deeper than what you're able to. But I'll tell you one thing is, there are places where it's very low. And I'm 6 feet and 1 inch. And as many times as I remind myself to duck and to stay low, I bang my head every time. I've left so much skin at the top of Hezekiah's tunnel, I can't tell you. And I'm telling you though, but if you're walking like this for about a third of a mile, it gets tired for a while, right? Near the end, the rock was cut higher, okay, because the people at that end evidently created more headroom than at the earlier portions. And that's again a shot of Hezekiah's tunnel as you're walking through it. And then near the end of the tunnel, okay, we have this inscription that had been discovered. This inscription is currently in the Istanbul Archeological Museum, and it is the most coveted artifact that Israel would like to have returned to Jerusalem. The Turkish people have it, and they're not giving it up. But the inscription reads this. This is what is inscribed. This is the story of the tunnel. While the axes were against each other, and while 3 cubits were left to cut, the voice of a man called to his counterpart. In other words, they could hear others. For there was Zada in the rock on the right. What's Zada? We don't know. Okay, it could be a fissure where water was leaking through, kind of an indication that, hey, we should cut here. We don't know what Zada means. But there was Zada in the rock on the right. And on the day of the tunnel being finished, the stonecutters struck each man towards his counterpart, axe against axe, and there flowed water from the source to the pool for 1,200 cubits. The city was saved. Maybe. Okay? Well, let's go back to 2 Kings. Hezekiah rebelled against the king of Assyria and did not serve him. In the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. Whew. All of them, except Jerusalem. We have this also on a cylinder. This is called Sennacherib cylinder, found at Nineveh, dated to the very end of the 8th century, beginning of the 7th century, describing the campaigns of Sennacherib against the Babylonians, Israel, and in particular Jerusalem. Let's go back to Isaiah. This is what Isaiah is saying to Hezekiah. Woe to those who go down to Egypt for help, who rely on horses, who trust in the multitude of their chariots and in the great strength of their horsemen, but do not look to the Holy One of Israel. Remember, what did Hoshea do in the north? He pled with the Egyptians. Did the Egyptians help him? We don't know, but not much, wasn't enough. Okay, and Isaiah is saying to Hezekiah, hey, Hez, the Egyptians aren't going to rescue you. He continues, the Lord Almighty will shield Jerusalem, and it will shield and deliver it. He will pass over it and rescue it. Assyria will fall by a sword that is not of a man. A sword not of mortals will devour them. So this is what Ike is saying to Hezekiah. Trust in the Lord. He's the only one that's going to save you. It isn't going to be your walls. It isn't going to be your water. It isn't going to be Egypt. Trust in God alone. Now, on the other hand, outside of the walls of Jerusalem, you have Sennacherib. Okay? Sennacherib, of course, doesn't want to lose troops. He wants to end this matter quickly. He wants to sack Jerusalem. And this is what he sends a message. Say to Hezekiah, king of Judah, do not let the God you depend on deceive you when he says Jerusalem will not be handed over to the king of Assyria. Surely you have heard what the kings of Assyria have done to all the countries, destroying them completely. You know this. And you will be delivered? Did the gods of the nations that were destroyed by my forefathers deliver them? No. Will your God deliver you? So now Hezekiah is hearing it from both sides. Should I surrender and hope for terms? Maybe we can come to some kind of an agreement. Or do we hold out? So Isaiah comes back. Out of Jerusalem will come a remnant. Out of Mount Zion, a band of survivors. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. Concerning the king of Assyria, he will not enter this city, declares the Lord. I will defend this city and save it for my sake and for the sake of David my servant. Whose advice does Hezekiah listen to? Well, we have another very valuable artifact from the Assyrians, and this is what is called Sennacherib's prism, which was written afterwards. And this is a translation of a portion. Of course, this prism, of course, describes all the great accomplishments of Sennacherib. He's boasting about this is what kings do, this is what presidents do, right? You know? And this is just a portion. As for Hezekiah the Judean, who did not submit to my yoke, 46 of his strong fortified cities, as well as the small cities in their vicinity, I besieged and conquered. Hezekiah himself, like a caged bird, I shut up in Jerusalem, his royal city. And the terrifying splendor of my majesty overcame him. And he sent rich tribute to me in Nineveh. What actually happened? Well, you notice that he doesn't say that he sacked Jerusalem. He may have sacked and destroyed 45 cities, mopped up all of Judea. But this is what the scriptures tell us. 2 Kings chapter 19. It happened that night that the angel of the Lord went out and struck 185,000 in the camp of the Assyrians. And when men rose early in the morning, behold, all of them were dead. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and returned home and lived at Nineveh. That's the rest of the story. This teaches us about faith and trust. Lots of times we are people who trust in our own industry, what we're able to do. And that's all good to an extent. But we can never forget that our ultimate trust lies with God. God can move mountains. God can do things far beyond our own expectation. And where circumstances seem impossible, and it must have seemed impossible to Hezekiah, he listened to the prophet Isaiah. And God delivered. Now we're over time a little bit, but I just want to show you one other thing. Okay? And this is an artifact, which is a signet ring, supposedly a signet ring of Jezebel. Jezebel, of course, was one of the earlier queens. She had married Ahaz of the northern kingdom. And you can see that it's got many Egyptian representations on this. This is supposedly, again, her signet ring. This is believed to be a hoax. And this is one of the problems that we have in archaeology. I just want to mention this because it comes up frequently. Lots of times we have artifacts that turn up on the antiquities market. Okay? If there are artifacts that are excavated in a dig, we know it's legit. You follow me? But we also have artifacts that every now and then will turn up on the antiquities market. Some of them, no doubt, are legit, but some of them are also probably fake. This one, according to the Israeli Antiquities Authority, the IAA, they believe is a fake. And so, just want to throw that out because there's always concern about whether or not something that you may see on the internet, whether it's real or whether it's fake. But again, we're a few minutes after 7 o'clock. I want to open things up to you if you have questions or comments on what we've been talking about. Mm-hmm.
And I know that kind of happens in many places where you see people like handbags. What's your sense of what those represent or used for, anything about it?
I'm not a Assyrian expert, so I'm sure there's an explanation, Bruce, but I can't. I'm breathing into this thing. You can hear me okay? I couldn't tell you what it is. You know, if I go back. Of what value is my wild guess? This is what you're talking about? Yeah. I couldn't even toss out a wild guess. But it looks like a purse or a bag or something that he's carrying. But I couldn't tell you what it is. Others. Well, thank you. You've been a very kind audience, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week.